Well, hello everyone. I'm so happy that you're all joining me for this roundtable. I'm Nicole Coleman, and I am one of the co-authors of Impuls Deutsch 1 and 2. And I'm talking today to our wonderful guest authors from the second part of the second volume. So let's go around once and introduce ourselves, and then we'll go and talk a little bit about diversity in Impuls Deutsch. Didem, do you want to start? You're left of me here.
Sure, thank you, Nicole. So my name is Didem Uca, and I'm Assistant Professor of German Studies at Emory University, which is located in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm one of the steering committee members of the Coalition of Women in German, as well as the Diversity, Decolonization, and the German Curriculum Collective. And I'm also the co-chair of the MLA Committee on the Status for Graduate Students in the Humanities. I'm also co-editor of the Jahrbuch Türkisch-Deutsche Studien.
Thank you. Joela.
Hi, my name is Joela Jacobs. I'm an assistant professor of German studies at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And I am the co-coordinator of the Environmental Studies Network at the GSA, and I coordinate the Literary and Cultural Plan Studies Network.
Okay, and Priscilla.
Hi, I'm Priscilla Lane. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm also the vice president of the AATG, and I'm a board member at the German Studies Association, and I'm a member of the 20th and 21st Century German Studies Forum at the MLA.
Before we talk in more detail about the work that our guest authors did for the second part of Impuls Deutsch 2, I want to give a brief overview of diversity within the textbook series overall. For example, in Lernen, students describe 12 different family constellations, including traditional families, single parents, gay and lesbian couples with kids, multi-ethnic families, or couples without kids. We chose to call this Mein Umfeld instead of Die Familie to focus on all the important people in one's life. We use the gender Sternchen, but we don't just use it, we explain gendered nouns and why we choose the gender Sternchen in the book, so that students realize how language and language use are important. We provide information about gender-neutral pronouns in an info box in Lernen, and then include a question about pronouns in a Machen activity. Also in our pictures, we try to show as much diversity as possible. Again, multiple ethnicities and religions, not just slim models, incorporating handicapped people. In this unit about an ideal workout, we included a student with Down syndrome, Hans, and a transgender person, Maria. We also don't assume every student is able-bodied. All instructions are written in a way that students who do have disabilities can do them. It is very important to us that students are introduced to a pluralistic image of German-speaking countries. The engagement with a diverse culture of those countries also fosters students' critical intercultural competence, and that we encourage them to reflect on their own customs and traditions in dialogue with others. Throughout the book, we stay away from the term native speaker of German, since it suggests to students a certain lack of belonging to the German-speaking community. We encourage our students to see themselves as an active part of that community by featuring a diverse set of voices and speakers throughout the book. Now we're moving to Impuls Deutsch 2 and the second part of Impuls Deutsch 2, chapters 5 through 8, and you see each chapter's cover here. All chapters so far have made an effort to be inclusive. We have just seen some examples, but this part of the book will highlight groups of people who have been previously marginalized. We invited our guest authors for this exact purpose, and we see this work as part of the effort to decolonize German studies, to center those who have been marginalized in history, and to highlight the integral part they have and continue to play in Germany and German culture. So let's go back to the group now and see what our experts have to say about these goals, rewards and challenges along the way, and their takeaways. Okay, first question I have for everyone, and let's see where we want to start, is that as a guest author, you were actually focused on a specific group of people. So we had originally thought that we would organize the second part as one chapter at a time representing the group of people, but then we went away from that and we tried to interweave the different groups into all of the chapters. But before we start with kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of what you actually did, I was wondering whether you could just say a few words about the group that you represented, that you included in the material, what the group's position is in German society at this point, and also how it is usually presented in material or where the lack of representation possibly comes from. Maybe we'll start with the other way around this time. Priscilla, would you like to go first?
Sure. So the group that I presented in the book are Black Germans. And Black Germans represent a pretty small minority in Germany. It's estimated that about 1% of Germans identify as Black. However, they have a very long history in Germany, going back centuries. And unfortunately, this older history tends to be ignored. So a lot of the times there's focus on, you know, specifically the post-war period, so the Black Germans who were born to African-American soldiers and white German mothers. A lot of times when people think about Black Germans, they also may think of, say, African immigrants. So people often don't realize that you can go back much farther in history and find Black Germans as well. Oh, sorry. What else was I supposed to address? Anything else?
The teaching materials.
Oh, okay. So the kinds of teaching materials I wanted to include a variety. So generally when students are familiar with Black Germans, they may be familiar with them as, say, athletes, playing on the national soccer team, or maybe as musicians, like, rappers or TV personalities. So I tried to do a combination of showing students, Black Germans who are pretty popular or present in the public eye, but also including Black German authors, politicians, activists, just so students get a more complete idea of how diverse the Black German community is.
Okay, thank you, Priscilla. Joela.
Yeah, my focus was on Jewish Germans, and I think one of the typical representations is, of course, related to the Holocaust in German textbooks and materials. So one thing that was really important to me was to show that there are many kinds of Jewish Germans. There are many ways to live Jewish life in Germany in the present. So of course there's a long history as well, but my focal point was to show that there isn't just this lens of victimhood that is often applied. And then I wanted to show also how diverse this group is, because when you're looking at even just the numbers of who identifies as Jewish in Germany, it gets very complicated. It gets complicated how people identify, whether it's through their heritage, their belief, cultural traditions. And there are a variety of groups that have in recent years moved to Germany and with a variety of backgrounds. And so the main idea was just to show how different it can look when you identify as Jewish in Germany.
Thank you.
And I was tasked with representing Turkish German experiences, sort of more specifically, and also more generally, the migrant and post-migrant experience, which I was really excited to be able to do, actually working beyond just the Turkish German context, because I think it's really important to think about how different groups of people of migrant heritage experience similar problems of xenophobia, of racism, of Islamophobia, etc. So in some of my materials, I focused not just on Turkish Germans, but also other Germans of migrant heritage or experience. I think that this was especially important in a unit that I wrote for on Twitter activism, where there was this really strong and important outcry of people of migrant heritage who are often considered to not be really from Germany. And they started hashtag campaigns that really fought for their inclusion as people of people living in Germany today. Does that mean that they want to only identify themselves as German? No, not necessarily. So a lot of these identity questions are really complex, and I didn't want to oversimplify them for the students. I find oftentimes in teaching materials that there's always this question of, oh, is this person Turkish or German? And actually, it's a lot more complicated, a lot more nuanced than that. And I wanted to present these issues in their full complexity as much as you can in a 2-page unit. A lot of times, so as a Turkish American myself, the way that I encountered Turks being portrayed in teaching materials when I was learning German in college was often very tokenizing. There would be only white Germans represented. You had, Hans and Peter and Gretchen. And then all of a sudden you would have Mehmet, the truck driver. So all of the white Germans were in college and they were studying and talking about their careers. And you had Mehmet, the truck driver, who doesn't know where he belongs. I mean, this is literally quoting out of a textbook that I was using at the time. So Mehmet is my father's name. Maybe this particularly disturbed me because of that. So I think it's very important to offer diverse, class backgrounds, education backgrounds, of course. That's very good to portray that as a part of contemporary life. But if you only portray college students, university students, except for the one person of color featured in the textbook, that's a different type of choice that material is making. So I really wanted, like the others, to also show, the diversity of experiences within this Turkish and post-migrant community.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll stay with that point for just a little while longer before we move on to other questions, because I think the question of tokenization and of how these groups are usually presented, whether it is through just one very specific historical context or as just being one part of German society rather than some people all across German societies or German-speaking societies, right, is really important. So maybe we can circle back and see how Joela and Priscilla thought about those issues.
Let's see. Well, initially when we were going to have the separate chapters, I addressed this issue by having sections, within the Black German chapter that would say address activism, address poetry, literature, address historical issues. I try to, be inclusive, so have, voices of different genders, people with different backgrounds. That's one of the unique things about the Black German community is you can have people who have roots, in North America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, connections to other parts of Europe. So it's a very, very diverse group, within the community, and I try to portray that. I also, try to take a very large historical lens, so that students understood that this is not a group that suddenly appeared 20 years ago, but as I said, that there is a long history that is necessary. For example, understanding the colonial history is necessary to understand the activism today.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of an example. I wrote a little dialogue for a person named Ariel, and I think what came out in that exercise is how all these differences also intersect in biographies and lives in Germany today. So that even though this was a fictionalized biography, this could very well be a real person who has one parent coming, let's say, from Russia, not having much Jewish cultural heritage, but having some traditions and maybe foods and so forth that get handed down to that side of the family. And there might be another side of the family where there are relatives in Israel or in the US. And so in a lot of ways, I think what also came out in these intersectional identities was how many connections there are to the world that isn't German speaking necessarily, right? Beyond just a textbook, which is something that often in textbooks, you have this bubble, this universe, as if they were just the German speaking countries, or maybe even just Germany, right? Very often. And so to broaden out into what lived experiences look like, where there are these connections into the world and into other traditions, and where they sometimes conflict with one another, right? Where it's not necessarily a smooth image, where those different parts of your heritage maybe sometimes have you puzzle over what to do with them and how to live them or not live them yourselves. I think that was something that also I think was important to me.
Yeah, I think in general, identity is just so important in that whole second part, and not just of the different groups that you represented, or the individual members of the different groups that you represented, but also of students encountering those groups. And I think with this focus, it is really possible to think intersectionally and in many ways about the diversity within and across all of those communities, which is why we eventually said one chapter per group doesn't actually work so well, because it may actually end up being more tokenizing than having just the presence across the board. I think one point that we also had to think about quite deeply is, because we're in a language book, the language that we used, and the language that students just don't have or don't know, because as a German, we may have a reaction to certain words and don't use words, or do use words because we know whether or not we can use them. Language learners don't have that. So we had to be quite explicit about language use, especially regarding race and migration. Does anyone want to talk more about the specifics that you found most important when it came to language and your groups? Yeah, Joela.
I'll start with an example that maybe can get us into the more complex ones. One really simple one was the gender Sternchen that we were using across the book. And when you do that for Jude and Jüdin, you end up with Jud Sternchen innen, right? So you end up with an umlaut where for the masculine version, you wouldn't have that. And that was even, so that's something that we had to negotiate, where through the many review processes, oftentimes people ask, is this correct? Is it, how do you say that? What do you do with that? And I could imagine that with students, it would be a similar process to say, what are all these dots and stars doing here? And what do we do? How do we say it, right? And how, and why is it there for this group? So that was one where, it just didn't come easily even to many of the reviewers. So in a lot of ways, I think the book is not just responding to a reaction someone might have. I think it's also forging a path forward to make a usage more, to normalize a usage and make it more mainstream, maybe in cases where it hasn't been the case. I mean, someone who's working in Jewish studies or is involved with the Jewish community in Germany will have seen that, but maybe not all Germans will have seen it. So I think that's also an important point of what the book does.
Right, thank you. And actually that particular problem that we had while reviewing and writing also made us later then come up with kind of a gender star tutorial that we have at the beginning of the book now, that talks exactly about these grammatical items, grammatical facets that may get lost in the gender star, and why it's still important to use it. So it kind of, it informs other parts of the book as well, which I think is so productive. Thank you. Didem, I saw you had something.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is also really important for discourses on communities of color in Germany is that there is borrowing, linguistic borrowing, also from English-speaking contexts. So for example, one thing that was important to understand sort of the positionality of some of the figures that I was representing was using the term people of color, which is of course a term borrowed from English, and using this in English within a German textbook, a German-speaking context, because this is how the term is also used in German-speaking countries today by people of color who are living there. So I think, sometimes we don't want to use any English, or we want to have our blinders on in a sense and say, we really want to just pretend as though this is a monolingual context, right? I mean, our language textbooks often, as Joela was suggesting, sort of put such a strong focus on a national or on a purely linguistic, society, as though there aren't influences from outside. So I think that is really important. I know that when I was writing, I was also thinking about different discourses around the term Turkish Deutsch or Deutsch Türkinnen. So these are sort of problems that I don't think I solved in any in any great way, but those are things that I think would also be really interesting to bring up with students. Like why do you think that there are different terms used? How do you identify yourself? So I think that these topics, even beyond, let's say, that Black German, Turkish German, or post-migrant German or Jewish German context, can be opportunities for people to reflect, you know, um, critically on their own cultural identity and what it means to identify in a certain way. So I hope that these topics also lend themselves to those type of reflective discussions in the classroom as well.
And actually, to extend that topic of post-migrant identities just a little bit, you all were mostly involved with the textbook, but in the workbook, we have these little biographies of, I think, 27 people from all over the German society, different backgrounds. And when we went through the review process there, somebody pointed out that we almost always had the birthplace in there. I think, Joela, you may have been one of these people. And so we scrapped the birthplaces almost everywhere because birthplace can separate people, right? So the migration background of people, how does that inform somebody's identity is very different for different people. And we don't want to impose what these things mean for people. So it's been a very deliberate process of thinking about what information actually matters and how to work with that in the language we use.
On the other hand, in my unit on Turkish German hip hop and Heimat, I think I pointed out quite intentionally, when somebody was born in Germany as opposed to in Turkey, because that is also an important part of their identity, of their experience. And when people try to exclude them from German society, they say, where else am I supposed to go? Right? I was born here. This is the context in which I grew up. So I think the birthplace is often politicized, and that's really important to also bring up in the classroom. I think now knowing that information, when we teach with this material, we can also say, why do you think the birthplace was left off? So we can always talk about these decisions.
Yeah, because how often do we start first semester with, where are you from, right? How often do we ask that? And how much does that question in the German context mean an externalization, right? When we think of the Me Too hashtags that Didem also referred to with the Twitter activism, how often do we have the where are you from? No, where are you really from as that point where people do feel othered in the German context?
Okay, so for me, a few things were important for language. First, there are generally two terms that people use, Afrodeutsch and Schwarzerdeutsche. Often people will use it interchangeably. For me, I find Schwarzerdeutsche to be more inclusive, just because I've found it used to describe people who were born in Germany or not born in Germany, migrated to Germany. So I like to use that term to include all Black people living in Germany. But I do occasionally use Afrodeutsch when the person describes themselves as such. Another thing with language is when I write someone is Schwarz or Schwarzerdeutsche, I capitalize the S because generally Black is seen as a political term, both in the U.S. and in Germany, and so I wanted to emphasize this is a political identification, and it's not describing how someone's skin looks. And then finally, I try to avoid using derogatory language. So like if I use the text where the N word appeared, I would only have the N and a dash or something along those lines, just to make it clear to students that this is language that can be hurtful And I don't want to normalize it because I think students sometimes get confused, especially when we're looking at historical documents, about what is appropriate to use and what's not. So I think that's always important to discuss in the classroom.
And I know that the book also used the English term race. And I think that that's, you know, for my group, that is also particularly relevant, right? The discussions in Germany about Rasse were the ones led by Nazis, and it's a different concept to discuss. And so using the term race to signal the difference and to say that these aren't mutually translatable, even though a dictionary might show you that they are, I think is a really good way to problematize and have a conversation starter about, you know, what it is that we're actually talking about here, right? And I think especially with belonging to these groups or not, you know, there are these almost flat definitions, right? For in Germany, a lot of the time for Jewish Germans, it's considered a religion, and that is how you solve all the complications that are attached to this. And so, but that's just too simple, right? And I think to think through identity in these layered ways is something that, you know, I'm particularly impressed that in a second year language book that this is happening, but I think it can happen. And I think we've all seen in our classrooms that this can happen if you give the right prompt, and sometimes it's just one word, right? And you get into a conversation if you scaffold this well enough for the language level of the students.
Yeah, and we were pretty deliberate with also talking about these terms particularly. So we have a box about race and problematizing it, how it is a social category, but how the German word may go back to perspectives that it may be biological. And we go there head on, right? By having a unit on DNA and really thinking about that, which I also remember was something that was quite difficult when then thinking again about the Jewish context. Joela, do you want to say just a couple of words about that? Do you remember that?
Yeah, because sometimes we have one way of thinking or discussing these things that comes out of a certain context, but it might not hold up in the other, and we sort of ran into that with thinking about Jewish identity, because a lot of Jewish identity is formed or is defined in biological ways, at least traditionally, that you inherit your Jewish identity from your mother, and that it's already problematic if it's just your father. And so when you think through these concepts and you put that in context with other identities where the biological is exactly sort of where perhaps the problems are in the discussions, right? It becomes really tricky, and it's a quite complex question to think through. And that's why, you know, when I said earlier on that the numbers were so tricky, I mean, in part it's due to that self-identification and identification by someone else or another group, or identification through your tax records or your passport or whatever it may be, right? That all of these are sort of fraud ways of identification, and except for the self-identification, I would say, because we get something imposed on someone else. And I think that's interesting, Priscilla, when you brought up the term Afro-German too. I mean, it's there too, we sort of have to ask, and the same for the terms you mentioned, Didem. It really, you know, I'm always fascinated by the hyphen that's between all of these terms, right? What does it actually do? Is this sort of subtracting, or is it an addition, right? And why do we have to have these two, and why don't we do it for certain other groups, right? So writing that someone is white, for instance, or writing that someone is Christian, can also become really important to sort of show the implied assumptions.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that page that started out as kind of problematizing racism through biology became so much more complex because each of these groups have different needs in a way when we teach about them to really understand them as a group, which just made it so much richer for sure. So I think we touched on this already a little bit, but I want to put this out there again, just in case you haven't mentioned something yet. Your goals when you approached your units. So what was particularly important to you when doing so? And what were maybe the challenges that you met? And what did you do when you met them? Somebody has an idea. Didem, okay.
Like I said, as a student and also as a beginning German instructor, I encountered a lot of tokenizing and upsetting depictions of Turkish Germans that I definitely wanted to avoid repeating some of these problems. So one thing, I really wanted to write a unit where hip hop was featured. But as an instructor in graduate school, I actually taught from a textbook that featured a hip hop unit by a Turkish German artist that I found extremely problematic because it was really it was a text that I've written about. I won't talk about the artist right now, but that seemed to almost be written for a white German audience in a way where it was really only focusing on misogyny within the Turkish German community rather than also reflecting on misogyny in the white German community, seeming to suggest that misogyny is a Turkish issue rather than an issue that we encounter in all of our societies. And the words students in that activity had to fill in the blanks, and all of the blanks were like oppression, scared, alone, my father. I mean, it was like all of these tropes that are so often, unfortunately, associated with people of Muslim heritage or Turkish Germans, that I really wanted to avoid that, while also not trying to paint an overly rosy picture in which people aren't experiencing marginalization and oppression. They absolutely are. So what I wanted to do is show Turkish Germans as being, contributors to German society, not in like a neoliberal sense, but as people who are actively part of the cultural fabric of German life, and as unwittingly marginalized within that society and fighting against that marginalization through activism, through art, through politics. So not trying to deny an experience of marginalization by ignoring it, but by rather shifting the blame and saying that this is a problem within German society, within white German society, of not accepting, of not willingness to integrate people of various heritages in to the German society, rather than a problem of integration, as we so often see it, as being the fault of those who are themselves marginalized and kept out of this society. But how do you do that in a second year textbook? So I think drawing from really rich cultural examples that are from the perspective of those individuals. And this is why I was so grateful that I was able to really draw from primary materials, and that we were really basing our work from the perspective of the groups that are being represented, rather than writing about them from some top-down approach. So I think by presenting these groups in their diversity, we're able to show students a much more nuanced picture than what they are otherwise receiving in media and in other cultural forms.
Yeah, I would follow up on what Didem said about, presenting these groups from their perspective and not writing about them. That was very important to me, since I'm not Black German, but I am Black American. So I understand a lot of the experiences they've had, but it was important for me to also understand that their experience is very different than my own. So to not, present this kind of paternalist, narrative about them. Another thing that was challenging was finding images for the different sections, which can, when you want diverse stock photos, that's always a problem. but specifically with the historical periods. Like, so, you know, I discussed Anton Wilhelm Amo at some point, and I feel like there, when you Google him, the images appear, but people debate whether those are actually him or not because of how long ago he lived. But not just that, I mean, you know, we have tons of representations of Kant, you know, so it's not really the time period. It's just that unfortunately, black scholars, black artists were not always very valued. So, you know, just like we don't have his dissertation, we don't necessarily have an image of him, which is really unfortunate. So that was a bit tricky. Other than that, I would say that, you know, because I tried to start really far back and include examples from, you know, the colonial period and all kinds of different historical moments, I'm sure I'm trying to, I guess, provide snapshots. So I'm hoping to give students enough context that they have a good understanding of the Black German community that would want them to make them want to delve in more, you know, so use a snippet from a book so they can go read the entire book if they wanted to. So I hope that that's conveyed, that this is not like the total guide, you know, to the Black German community, but here are some snapshots for you to see what you're interested in and then, you know, look into it further.
Yeah, and I think I like the way you put this with the snapshot idea. I think there are also diverging narratives in this, right? So some of the things that I had picked out for materials, one was the Holocaust art project, where images of people jumping around on the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin were overlaid over images of people murdered in the Shoah. And so it's by an Israeli artist. And there are a lot of ethical questions you can ask here. I mean, obviously, maybe the one that the artist was asking primarily, whether, you know, how one should behave at a memorial site, right? But then it also becomes a question of who behaves how at a memorial site. If a young child would do this, nobody would bat an eye, right? So where do these expectations come from? And then this artist posted these images on the internet, and you had to email him to get undouched, as he put it, to get these images taken down. They're taken down from his website, but you can find them in news articles. And people started talking about consent then, but you can also ask about the consent of the murdered victims in these pictures, right? How do we actually position ourselves towards historical images in this, you know, particularly in this case, in terms of the ethics of showing, you know, these emaciated naked bodies, right? So, you know, the second you start to engage with this, there are ways to both criticize this art project and to endorse it, right? And students, I think, can find a position they want to land on, and they can think about social media in this context, and how do we define consent in lots of different ways, and the ethics of it. And so I think having the material also in some ways speak for itself, and not resolving all these tensions, and not having a smooth narrative that tells them sort of what to think, right? Because I think that's what often happens in textbooks, because vocabulary is limited, that there is one narrative that is chosen, and this is the one you learn, right? And that's how you get the tokenization, and that's how you get sort of the one idea, the one-dimensional idea of a really diverse group. And so it's a risk, and it's a challenge in some ways, I think. You know, teaching that unit in a classroom, I could see someone being nervous about it. And at the same time, I think there is really this kind of openness is the only way to sort of really engage the deeper questions of a project like that.
And I think that is really one of the things that is intercultural about it too, because intercultural is really not just talking about different cultures, but thinking about ambiguities, being able to stand uncertainties. All these questions are really important for me when I teach intercultural competence, but also for the book as promoting itself as intercultural. So I don't know whether you have an answer to this question. So let's see. Was there an activity or a unit that you particularly liked writing? just, while you were writing? Was there something that really excited you or that was just really fun to you? I could come up with examples for each of you. I've been teaching with it, or I really want to teach some of these things. But did you have something that you loved when you wrote it?
I would say one of the activities that I liked the best was the hashtag Murren. The discussion about post-colonial activism and Black Germans trying to get street names renamed that have been named after colonial terms or colonial figures. And I liked it because I personally haven't used a lot of social media in my teaching, but I like the idea of bringing that in, like having students go to Twitter because it's just so current. And I like the idea of just involving the platforms that students are already using instead of like shying away from technology. So it's a very active, engaged activity, and I hope that students enjoy it.
Yeah, so I'm trying to, so I think the most fun, but also the most challenging, I think, in my case, because I think I learned so much doing it. And that was what I enjoyed about it. So we wrote this little box for Yiddish on a page that also had dialects. And there are a lot of misconceptions about Yiddish, that it's a dialect of German, that it's written, it's written in Hebrew letters, which a lot of people don't realize. And so then you have to even just get them on the page in the right directionality and so forth, and in a book like that. And then I think there is this, because there are so many words that sound similar to German, German speakers engage with Yiddish differently than American speakers or just speakers of English do. And so there was a lot of back and forth which terms to include and how to do the exercise, and how certain speakers of certain languages could deduct information from these words or not. And so that was just really, really fascinating for me also to think through how to talk about Yiddish in both English and German, and sort of to bring that together on the page and talk about it, but in a way that's accessible in this context and very short. So that was a real challenge, but one that I really enjoyed. And I think my favorite find during working on Impuls was a Jewish Karnevalsverein, and I'm from the Rhineland, and that was just one of the most favorite things that I discovered. And yeah.
So one of the units that I haven't mentioned yet is one that I wrote on post-migrant theater, which was highlighting the Ballhaus Neunenstrasse theater in Berlin. So the main part of that day's classwork is for students to research plays that have recently been put on at this theater, and to discuss some of the main themes that come up in those theater pieces and why they're relevant to the experiences of people of color and people of migrant heritage in Germany today. But as sort of a warm-up activity for that day's lesson, the students had to do an improv theater piece where they pretended to be any object or anything they could really think of. And they had to act and portray and talk as though they were this thing. And then the other people in the classroom had to guess what they were. I find theater activities in the classroom to be an opportunity for students to just break down walls and to feel like they are able to be their embodied selves in the classroom, which of course leads to some vulnerability, but I think that that's really important as part of the language learning process. Particularly, this was important for me because I actually did some improv theater workshops when I was in Germany as part of an intercultural exchange group that I was in. And these were so successful to really just get us to get to know each other better and to feel like we had just the sense of mutual comfort as a group. So yeah, I wanted to sort of take that experience that I had in an intercultural communication context in Germany and translate that for this unit.
Okay, thank you. And I think those exercises are so diverse because, all of these groups are diverse. The whole book is just so varied. And I want to thank you all for being here and talking about your work, and of course for your work, because without you, this would not be half as good or half as rich as it turned out. And I'm really excited about what we have. So thank you all. And yeah, we'll see you at some point somewhere during the conference, maybe.
Perfect.
Bye.
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 Bye.